Hey everybody, it's Caitlin. Welcome back to CoronaChat. Today is Thursday, April 23rd, and it's kind of rainy out, so we're out here on the porch. And this week on CoronaChat, we've been talking about preprints and the fact that science is happening much faster right now than normal, right? And the sense of urgency that's driving scientists to focus on releasing more information faster and earlier is coming from a good place. After all, there's the pandemic on and people's lives hang in the balance. But all of this speed means that some of our normal quality assurance processes aren't quite in place before news and findings get broadcast out by the news media, which means that the news can swing back and forth really quickly about whether something's true or not true and give all of us listening a real sense of whiplash. This is playing out in lots of ways, but one that's especially present right now is all of the back and forth about hydroxychloroquine. So I want to focus specifically on that storyline tonight. So back in March, right, you may have heard something about chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine. These are drugs that are used to treat malaria and lupus normally. There have been a few small preliminary studies released from China and from France where doctors had treated COVID-19 patients with these drugs and had suggested that they might serve as a possible treatment. But these studies were very small. They didn't use a randomized process to assign people to the experimental treatment and control groups, right? Which meant that we couldn't tell from these studies if the drugs were actually making people better or if the people that were in the group that got the experimental treatment were just different from the people in the group that didn't in some way that was important, right? And specifically in a way that would have meant that those people would have gotten better whether they got the treatment or not, and the people in the control group wouldn't have. Right? There were also some concerns about the way that the data in these studies were analyzed, particularly the French study. There were a lot of concerns that this data analysis was not done properly, right? So the big concern with the French study was that there were several people who got very sick on the experimental treatment who were taken off of it and sent to a different hospital. And data on those patients should have been included in the analysis, but it was not, which maybe made it look like hydroxychloroquine was a better treatment than it actually was in reality. Right? So this led some scientists reading that study to question whether hydroxychloroquine was really the miracle treatment that the study authors claimed it was. And the scientific community called for chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine to be included in a proper clinical trial. That way we'd know for sure whether these drugs, either on their own or in combination with azithromycin or zinc, actually made any difference in combating COVID-19, right? So the World Health Organization, hearing this call, added chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine to the Solidarity trial, which is the world's largest clinical trial for experimental COVID-19 treatments. And this trial is currently ongoing and we're waiting on the results. Now, in the meantime, because there's no proven treatment for COVID-19, some hospitals began treating people with chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine anyway, figuring something was better than nothing, right? And these hospitals have been keeping track of their own results from these tests. So earlier this week, a preprint was released from the Bureau of Veterans Affairs. The Bureau of Veterans Affairs, takes care of sick veterans and their families. Has a very, very large hospital system, and they work with universities. So this particular study was conducted by doctors and researchers who, work at the VA, but also work at the University of Virginia School of Medicine and the University of South Carolina, right? And so they released their preliminary findings from their own use of hydroxychloroquine in Veterans Affairs hospitals. And again, they did 3 groups. So they had one group that didn't receive any experimental treatment. They had one group that got hydroxychloroquine only, and then they had another, regular care plus hydroxychloroquine. And then they had a third group that had regular care plus hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin. Right? So this study is the largest study yet. It has data from 368 patients compared to the 26 patients included in the French study. But it still does not assign patients to those treatment and control groups randomly, right? So this is important because it looks like there are differences that may be important between these groups. So for example, the patients that received the experimental drugs look like on average they might be a little bit older than the patients who didn't, and maybe they were a little bit sicker than those who didn't receive the experimental drugs, right? And that was probably because their doctors were saying, these patients are sickest, let's try the experimental treatment on them, right? And since these groups are not the same on average, it's possible that the differences that we're seeing in the outcomes between these two groups are due to differences in these people's underlying health or how serious their COVID-19 infections were, and not actually the treatment, right? So I say all of that to remind us to take the findings of this new study with a grain of salt, right? So what did they find? The new VA study found that people who received hydroxychloroquine were more likely to die than those who didn't receive it. Again, that those who received the experimental treatment of hydroxychloroquine were more likely to die than people who just got the best standard of care that we have without the experimental drugs. This is exactly the opposite result of what the French and Chinese studies found. But again, none of these studies are designed in a way to actually tell us what's going on, right? So the information we have to date does not allow us to say whether this drug functions or these drugs function or not as treatment for coronavirus. Right? So why not just let everyone have it to see if it works, right? There's also the possibility that this experimental treatment is killing people who would have otherwise survived, right? Which is what this new study from the VA suggests. And to use something as a treatment, we have to first be sure that it helps more people than it harms. Remember, the first tenet of medicine is first do no harm. And this is why we desperately need the real clinical trial that the World Health Organization is running to go forward. Right? A proper clinical trial will help us make decisions based on solid evidence, so we don't needlessly put people's lives at risk. But in the meantime, we're watching the news cover one small study at a time, none of which are designed in a way to actually give us the information we need. And as we see more and more of these preprints get covered in the news, we can expect to see more of these extreme pendulum swings in the headlines, right? Miracle cure turns out not to work. And it can be very confusing and make you just want to throw your hands up in the air and say, forget science. But we don't have to do that, right? You're an intelligent person. You can use what you know to read these headlines critically and think about what actually is going on, right? You do this every day with other things, so why should this be any different, right? Just remember the tips that we talked about yesterday. Pay attention to who did the research. Do they have any real expertise on this topic? Pay attention to where it was published. Was this in a trusted peer-reviewed journal, or is this a preprint that was just uploaded online? Pay attention to whether the study was conducted in actual human beings or just cells or lab animals, right? Think critically about the study itself. Did it have a control group? Were there at least 30 people in each group, the experiment group and the control group, right? Were people assigned to these groups randomly, or might there be differences in the groups that might be influencing the results, like the age or how sick people were? All of that's important, right? And lastly, and most importantly, the results sound like they're too good to be true, because they might be, right? This can be tough. I know it can be tough, especially when the headlines are screaming at us. But you've got this. You're smart. You're capable. You can tell the truth from fiction. And I believe in you. So we're in this together. Stay safe. Take care of each other. And I'll see you back here tomorrow on CoronaChat.